The grand hall of the Shadow Moon Palace glittered with 1,000 candles, their flames dancing across marble columns that reached toward vaulted ceilings, painted with scenes of ancient werewolf battles and triumphant hunts. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light over the assembled nobility, alphas and betas dressed in silks and furs that spoke of wealth accumulated over centuries of dominance. The air thrummed with power, thick with the mingled scents of expensive wines, roasted meats, and the underlying musk of predators pretending at civility. At the center of this opulence sat King Theron Nightshade, his presence commanding attention even in stillness, dark eyes scanning the crowd with an intensity that made lesser wolves drop their gazes in instinctive submission. He was everything the legends promised, broad-shouldered and dangerously beautiful, with black hair that fell past his collar and a face carved from the same unforgiving stone as the mountains that bordered his territory. Power radiated from him in waves that made the very air shimmer, the mark of an alpha so dominant that even other alphas felt the weight of his authority pressing against their wolves like a physical force. Alara moved through the shadows between the tables, her worn servant's dress a dull gray against the riot of colors worn by the guests, practically invisible as she refilled wine goblets and cleared away plates with practiced efficiency. She had learned long ago how to make herself small, how to move through spaces without drawing attention, because attention from the nobility meant nothing good for someone like her. An omega without a wolf, or so everyone believed. She was the lowest of the low in a society that measured worth by the strength of your beast and the purity of your bloodline. She had no family name, no pack affiliation, nothing but the tattered memories of being found as a child near the burned ruins of a village no one would speak of, taken in by the palace. Staff more out of obligation than kindness. The other servants pitied her at best, scorned her at worst, but it was the nobility who truly made her life a carefully orchestrated hell, and none more so than Queen Morgana and her daughter, Princess Celestia. Queen Morgana sat at the high table beside King Theron, her beauty as cold and sharp as winter ice, platinum hair arranged in an elaborate style that required 3 handmaids and 2 hours to achieve. She had been the king's mother's choice, a political marriage that brought alliance with the powerful Silvercrest pack, and she wore her position like armor, never letting anyone forget that she was queen by right and tradition. Her wolf was strong, her lineage impeccable, and her cruelty legendary among those who served in the palace. She surveyed the hall with eyes like chips of blue glass, missing nothing, and when her gaze landed on Alara struggling with a heavy wine pitcher, her lips curled into something that might have been a smile on someone with a soul. Beside her, Princess Celestia leaned forward with predatory interest, her own beauty a warmer but no less dangerous version of her mother's, auburn hair cascading over shoulders draped in emerald silk that probably cost more than Alara would earn in a lifetime of servitude. If you are enjoying this story of hidden power and forbidden destiny, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think will happen when Alara's true nature is finally revealed. Your support means everything, so don't forget to subscribe for more supernatural romance stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Alara approached the high table with her heart hammering against her ribs, the wine pitcher growing heavier with each step, though she knew the weight was more fear than actual burden. She kept her eyes downcast as she had been taught, but she could feel their attention on her like insects crawling across her skin, could sense the malicious delight building in Celestia's posture. The princess had been in a particularly vicious mood lately, ever since her father had rejected her suggestion of a mate from the Bloodfang pack, and Alara had learned through painful experience that Celestia's temper inevitably found an outlet in tormenting those who could not fight back. She reached for the queen's goblet, with a hand she willed not to shake. But before she could pour, Celestia's voice rang out across the sudden silence that fell over. Nearby conversations, bright and mocking and designed to carry to every ear in the vicinity. The princess stood abruptly, her chair scraping against marble with a sound like claws on stone, and fixed Alara with eyes that glittered with cruel amusement. She announced to the assembled nobles that they should all witness the palace's most pathetic creature, the Omega, who was so weak that even her wolf had abandoned her, leaving her less than human, barely worth the scraps they fed her from the Ye. Kitchens. Laughter rippled through the crowd, nervous at first because mocking servants was somewhat beneath their dignity, but growing bolder as Celestia continued her performance, clearly expecting her audience to appreciate her wit. She circled Alara like a predator toying with prey, asking in a voice dripping with false concern whether the poor little servant girl ever wondered what it felt like to shift, to run beneath the moon, to feel the power of a true werewolf coursing through her. Veins. The nobles laughed harder now, emboldened by the princess's cruelty, and Alara stood frozen in the center of their mockery, the wine pitcher clutched in white-knuckled hands, her face burning with humiliation that tasted like ashes in her mouth. Queen Morgana watched the spectacle with obvious approval, occasionally adding her own barbed comments about how charity toward the worthless was a burden the royal family bore with grace, how some bloodlines were simply too polluted to ever produce anything of value. She suggested that perhaps Alara should be grateful they allowed her to serve at such an important gathering, that most packs would have simply left a defective Omega like her to die of exposure as a mercy to the species. The words struck like physical blows, each one finding the vulnerable places in Alara's carefully constructed armor of indifference, the shields she had built over years of similar abuse. She wanted to run, to disappear into the servants' quarters and hide in her tiny room until the shame stopped choking her, but she was trapped by protocol and fear, unable to move without permission, unable to defend herself without making everything infinitely worse. Then Celestia made her mistake, the one that would change everything, though no one knew it yet. She reached out and shoved Alara hard in the chest, not expecting resistance, just enjoying the casual exercise of power over someone who could not fight back. The wine pitcher flew from Alara's. Hands, crimson liquid arcing through the air in a spray that splattered across the marble floor and the hem of Celestia's expensive dress. The princess shrieked in outrage, her face contorting with genuine fury now, no longer performing for the crowd, but genuinely enraged at this insult to her dignity. She raised her hand to strike Alara, and in that frozen moment, as fear and humiliation and a lifetime of swallowed rage converged into a single point of crystallized emotion, something inside Ilara cracked like a dam giving way before a flood. Power surged through her body with the force of a lightning strike, burning through veins that had never carried anything but ordinary blood, igniting nerves that suddenly sang with energy she had no name for. Her eyes, previously a nondescript brown that no one ever bothered to notice, blazed with golden light that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her core, a luminescence that had nothing to do with reflected candlelight and everything to do with something ancient and terrible and magnificent, finally waking from a long sleep. The air around her shimmered with heat distortion, and for just a heartbeat, every wolf in the grand hall felt their beasts react with confused recognition, their animals whining or snarling or pressing forward with interest, unable to categorize what they were sensing but knowing instinctively that it was significant, that the balance of power in the room had just shifted in a way none of them. Understood. King Theron's head snapped toward Ilara with predatory speed, his entire body going rigid with attention, dark eyes fixing on her with an intensity that made everything else in the room fade to insignificance. He had been half listening to a boring trade dispute between two minor lords, his mind elsewhere as it often was during these tedious social obligations. But now every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to pay attention, to understand what he was seeing, to claim and protect and possess in a way that had nothing to do with conscious thought and everything to do with the most primal parts of his alpha nature. His wolf surged forward inside him, more interested in this strange servant girl than it had been in anything or anyone in years, pushing at his control with an insistence that bordered on overwhelming. He stood without realizing he was moving, his chair falling backward with a crash that went unnoticed in the sudden chaos, his eyes never leaving Ilara's. Face as that golden glow faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her looking shocked and terrified, and somehow more real than anyone else in the entire glittering assembly. The moment shattered as quickly as it had formed. Celestia stumbled backward with a gasp that was equal parts fear and outrage, her hand dropping to her side as if she had been burned, her wolf clearly unsettled by whatever it had sensed in that brief flash of power. Queen Morgana rose to her feet with cold fury etched across her perfect features, her political instincts immediately recognizing a threat, even if she did not yet understand its nature. She ordered guards to seize Ilara, her voice cutting through the confused murmur of conversation that had erupted among the nobles. But before anyone could move, before the situation could spiral into violence or imprisonment, King Theron's voice rang out with absolute authority that allowed no argument, no discussion, no possibility of disobedience. He commanded, everyone to stop, to remain exactly where they were. His alpha dominance rolling over the assembled werewolves like a physical wave that drove lesser wolves to their knees and made even the strongest among them bare their throats in automatic submission. He stepped down from the high table with fluid grace, moving toward Ilara with measured steps that somehow conveyed both threat and fascination, his eyes never leaving her face as she stood trembling in the center of the hall, still trying to understand what had just happened to her. He stopped just beyond arm's reach, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the wild scent of him that was pine and smoke, and something indefinable that made her stomach clench with unfamiliar hunger. His voice when he spoke was quieter now, meant only for her, though of course everyone in the hall could hear with their supernatural senses, asking her name as if he did not already know it, as if she were someone who mattered rather than just another faceless servant. Ilara forced herself to meet his eyes, and that was her second mistake, or perhaps her salvation, because the moment their gazes locked, something slammed into place with the inevitability of planets falling into orbit, a connection that she felt in her bones and her blood, and the spaces between her heartbeats. His pupils dilated, and she watched his jaw clench as he clearly felt the same thing. This pull that had nothing to do with choice and everything to do with destiny, with fate, with whatever forces governed the mating bonds that could form between werewolves when the universe decided two souls were meant to intertwine. The air between them crackled with tension that was simultaneously threatening and intoxicating, and Ilara found herself unable to look away, unable to submit, even though every instinct of self-preservation was screaming at her to drop her gaze, to show proper respect to an alpha whose power could crush her. Without effort. Queen Morgana's voice shattered the moment, sharp with barely contained panic disguised as righteous indignation. She demanded to know what the king thought he was doing, why he was wasting time on a servant who had just demonstrated exactly the kind of dangerous instability that made her unfit for palace service. She suggested, with the kind of forceful subtlety that was really just a command wrapped in political niceties, that Ilara should be removed from the palace. Immediately, perhaps sent to serve in the outer territories where her obvious defects would not be an embarrassment to the crown. Several nobles murmured agreement, though whether they truly cared or were simply following the queen's lead was impossible to determine. Celestia had recovered enough to add her own protests, though her voice lacked its earlier confidence, her eyes darting between her father and the strange servant girl, who had somehow become the center of attention at what was supposed to be the princess's introduction to potential suitors from allied pacts. Theron ignored them all with the kind of complete dismissal that was more insulting than any direct contradiction. He spoke directly to Ilara, his voice still carrying that strange gentleness that seemed utterly at odds with his reputation as a ruthless alpha king who had united the fractured werewolf territories through a combination of strategic brilliance and overwhelming force. He asked if she was hurt, if the Yai princess had injured her when she pushed her, and the concern in his voice was so unexpected that Ilara felt tears prick her eyes, because no one had asked if she was hurt in longer than she could remember. No one had cared enough to notice when she bore bruises or walked with a limp from some casual cruelty inflicted by those who considered her less than nothing. She shook her head mutely, not trusting her voice, and watched something that might have been approval flash across his face before. He turned to address the assembled court, with a tone that brooked no argument and promised consequences for anyone foolish enough to challenge his authority. He announced that Ilara would be moved from the servants' quarters to the guest wing of the palace, that she would be provided with appropriate clothing, and given time to rest and recover from the obvious distress she had suffered during the evening's events. The nobles erupted in shocked whispers at this unprecedented elevation of a mere servant, and Queen Morgana's face went white with fury before flushing red with barely suppressed rage. But no one dared to openly protest because Theron's dominance was absolute, his will law, and his displeasure something that could end careers or lives, depending on the severity of the offense. He assigned 2 of his personal guard to escort Alara from the hall, warriors who were loyal only to him and would not take orders from anyone else, effectively putting her under his direct protection. In a way that made his interest unmistakable to everyone present. Then he dismissed the gathering with a gesture, ending the celebration hours earlier than planned, leaving the nobles scrambling to leave before they somehow became collateral damage in whatever power struggle was clearly brewing between the king and his queen. Alara found herself swept along by the guards, too shocked to fully process what was happening, her mind replaying that moment when power had surged through her body like lightning through a conductor. The guest wing was in an entirely different section of the palace, far from the cramped servants' dormitories where she had spent her entire life, and the room they brought her to was larger than the space she had shared with 6 other servants, furnished with actual furniture rather than just sleeping mats and a communal trunk for possessions. There was a bed, a real bed with a mattress and pillows and blankets that looked soft enough to drown in, and a window. That overlooked the palace gardens rather than the kitchen courtyard and its smells of refuse and cooking fires. The guards told her that someone would bring her food and clothing, that she was not to leave the room until the king sent for her. And then they took up positions outside her door, protective rather than imprisoning, though the line between the two was sometimes difficult to distinguish. She sat on the edge of the bed, afraid to actually lie down on something so fine with her dirty. Servant's dress, and tried to make sense of the evening's events. The golden light in her eyes, the surge of power that had felt like touching the sun, the way King Theron had looked at her as if she were something precious rather than worthless. These things did not fit into the world as she understood it, did not align with everything she had been taught about her place in the hierarchy of werewolf society. She had no wolf, or at least she had never felt one stirring inside her the way other. Wolves described it, had never experienced the call of the full moon, or the urge to shift and run on 4 legs instead of 2. But that power she had felt, that was something, was not nothing, was definitely not the emptiness that should have existed inside an Omega born, broken, and defective. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts, and a middle-aged woman entered carrying an elaborate dress that probably cost more than Alara had ever touched in her life. Deep blue silk embroidered. With silver thread in patterns that caught the light and seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The woman introduced herself as Lydia, one of the head seamstresses, and her manner was respectful in a way that made Alara uncomfortable because she had no experience being treated with anything but contempt or pity. Lydia helped her out of the stained servant's dress and into the silk gown, her professional hands making quick work of laces and adjustments. And when Alara finally saw, herself in the full-length mirror, she barely recognized the young woman staring back at her. The dress transformed her, made her look like someone who belonged in the palace's public spaces rather than its kitchens and storage rooms. And for the first time in her life, She understood why nobles placed such importance on appearance. Because clothing was armor, was identity, was a statement of worth in a society that judged everything by surface presentations. Lydia also brought food, real food. Rather than the servants' portions of whatever was left after the nobles had eaten their fill, and Alara ate with an appetite sharpened by stress and shock, tasting flavors she had only smelled from a distance. The seamstress chatted as she worked, apparently having decided that Alara was going to be important enough that cultivating her goodwill was a smart political move. And through careful questions, Alara learned that the entire palace was buzzing with speculation about what had happened in the Grand Hall. Some said that King Theron had finally decided to replace Queen Morgana, that he had been looking for an excuse to set aside a wife who had given him no sons and only one daughter who was beautiful, but cruel. Others claimed that Alara must be a spy from a rival pack, planted in the palace years ago and only now revealing herself in some complicated political maneuver. A few whispered about ancient prophecies and bloodlines thought extinct, but these were dismissed as superstition. By more practical-minded wolves. The truth, as Alara was beginning to suspect, might be stranger and more dangerous than any of the rumors. She thought about those brief flashes of memory she sometimes had, dreams that felt more real than sleeping fantasies should, visions of running through forests on 4 legs, of howling at moons that blazed with colors that did not exist in the waking world, of power that made the earth tremble and the sky weep. She had always dismissed these as the desperate imagination of someone born without a wolf, wish-fulfillment dreams conjured by a mind that could not accept its own limitations. But what if they were memories? Real memories of something that had been locked away, or hidden, or stolen. Something that was only now beginning to wake up and remember what it was meant to be. King Theron stood in his private study, staring at the portrait of his father that dominated one wall, trying to reconcile what he had felt in the Grand Hall with everything he knew about werewolf nature and the rules that governed their society. The mate bond was supposed to be sacred, an unbreakable connection that formed between wolves whose natures complemented each other perfectly, whose souls recognized each other across any distance. But it was also supposed to form between equals, between alphas and strong betas, or occasionally between 2 alphas if the chemistry was right. It was not supposed to snap into place between an alpha king and a servant. Omega, who did not even have a wolf, or at least who should not have a wolf based on everything the palace physicians had reported over the years of her service. Except she clearly did have something, some power that his wolf had recognized instantly, even if his mind was still struggling to categorize it. The way her eyes had blazed with golden light, that was not normal, was not anything he had encountered in decades of dealing with werewolves of every rank and bloodline. Gold was the color of alpha dominance taken to its ultimate expression, the mark of kings and conquerors, the sign of bloodlines so pure and powerful that they appeared perhaps once in a generation if fate was generous. It was his color, the shade his eyes took when his wolf rose close to the surface, and seeing it reflected in a servant girl's gaze had shaken him in ways he was not prepared to admit, even to himself. His beta and closest advisor, Marcus, entered without knocking, because they had known each other. since childhood and protocol between them had been abandoned long ago in favor of brutal honesty. Marcus was everything a good beta should be: loyal without being servile, strong without threatening his alpha's dominance, clever enough to offer counsel but wise enough to know when to simply listen. He dropped into a chair without invitation and observed that Theron looked like a man who had just seen a ghost or found a treasure, and he could not decide which would be more troubling under the circumstances. Theron poured them both drinks from the crystal decanter on his desk, expensive whiskey that burned smooth and warm, and told Marcus everything, describing the moment when the mate bond had clicked into place with a certainty that left no room for doubt or denial. Marcus listened in silence, his expression growing increasingly troubled as the story unfolded. And when Theron finished, the beta sat back with a long exhale and observed that this was going to be a political nightmare. Of epic proportions. Queen Morgana would not surrender her position without a fight, and she had allies among the noble families who valued tradition and bloodline purity above all else. Setting aside a queen to elevate a servant would be seen as an insult to every high-born wolf in the kingdom, would raise questions about whether Theron valued his own pleasure over political stability, would potentially fracture the alliances that held the kingdom together. And that was before even considering the mystery of what Alara actually was, because if she truly carried alpha bloodline markers, then someone had deliberately hidden her origins, had placed her in the palace as a servant for reasons that could range from protective to sinister, depending on who had orchestrated the deception. Theron acknowledged all of these concerns because he was not a fool and had not survived decades of political intrigue by ignoring uncomfortable realities. But he also knew that fighting a true mate bond was like fighting the tide, possible in the short term, but ultimately futile, and the longer he resisted, the more damage it would do to both him and Alara. His wolf was already agitated, pacing inside his mind, demanding that he go to her, claim her, protect her from threats both known and unknown. The rational part of his mind insisted that he needed to investigate first, to understand what was happening before making decisions that could not be unmade. But rationality was losing ground with every passing hour. Marcus suggested, with the careful tone of someone offering advice to a powerful predator who might not want to hear it, that perhaps they should start by researching the old records, looking for any information about destroyed villages or lost bloodlines that might explain Alara's origins. The palace library contained centuries of pack records, census data, birth registries, everything needed to trace lineages back through generations. If Alara truly carried royal blood, there would be some documentation, some thread they could follow to unravel the mystery. Theron agreed, though part of him wanted to simply claim her and deal with the consequences later, his alpha nature chafing at the idea of political maneuvering, when what he really wanted was to storm down to the guest wing and make sure she was safe and comfortable in his. They worked through the night, pulling dusty volumes from shelves that had not been disturbed in decades, cross-referencing names and dates. Looking for gaps in the records that might indicate deliberate erasure of information. Marcus had enlisted the help of the head archivist, an elderly wolf named Cornelius, who had served 3 generations of kings and knew the library's contents better than anyone alive. The old scholar listened to their carefully vague questions with shrewd eyes that missed nothing, and after a long moment of consideration, he shuffled to a locked cabinet in the deepest corner of the archives and retrieved a leather-bound journal that smelled of age and secrets. The journal had belonged to Theron's grandfather, written during the twilight years of his reign, when the kingdom had been racked by civil war between rival alpha families fighting for dominance. Cornelius turned to a series of entries marked with a red seal, a designation that meant the information was considered too dangerous or sensitive for general access, and began reading aloud in his quavering voice. The entries described a prophecy that had surfaced during that turbulent time, speaking of a child born with the mark of the first Alpha, a bloodline so pure that it connected directly to the primordial wolves who had walked the earth before humans learned to make fire. This child would be born in darkness during a blood moon, would carry power that could unite or destroy the werewolf nation depending on how it was guided, would be hunted by those who feared change, and protected by those who understood that evolution was necessary for survival. The prophecy had caused such upheaval that Theron's grandfather had ordered all children born during the specified time period to be carefully documented and monitored, their development tracked to see if any showed signs of the predicted power. But then, one of the registered families had died in a fire that destroyed their village and everyone in it, or so the official reports claimed. The entry in the journal suggested that the fire might not have been accidental, that forces opposed to the prophecy might have taken preemptive action to prevent it from coming true. The family's name was listed as Silvermane, and they had lived in a village called Moonhaven, which had been erased so thoroughly that even its location was uncertain in modern records. Theron felt ice slide down his spine as pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Alara had been found near burned ruins as a child, brought to the palace, and deliberately placed in a position where she would be overlooked and dismissed, where her potential would never be recognized or developed. Someone had saved her from whatever had destroyed her family, had hidden her in the one place where she might survive to adulthood, but that someone had not revealed themselves or provided any guidance about her true nature. The question was whether that person had been protecting her or simply waiting for the right moment to use her as a weapon in some larger game. Marcus pointed out the obvious. Complication that was surely occurring to Theron as well, which was that if Alara truly was the prophesied child, then her very existence was a threat to the established order, and Queen Morgana was exactly the kind of traditionalist who would view the prophecy as a danger rather than an opportunity. The Queen had built her power base on her impeccable bloodline and her position as mother to the presumed heir, and Alara's emergence as a potential rival threatened everything Morgana had spent. Decades constructing. If Morgana had known or suspected Alara's true identity, she might have deliberately kept her suppressed through psychological abuse and social isolation, ensuring that the servant girl never developed enough confidence or self-awareness to access her latent power. Subscribe to this channel if you want to see how this forbidden romance unfolds, and drop a comment telling me whether you think the Queen will try to eliminate Alara now that her secret is beginning to emerge. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people who love supernatural romance as much as you do. Theron made a decision that was probably reckless, but felt absolutely necessary in the moment. He left Marcus to continue researching and made his way through the silent palace corridors to the guest wing, dismissing the guards at Ilara's door with a gesture and entering without announcing himself, because this was his palace, and he went where he pleased regardless of propriety or protocol. He found her sitting on the window seat, still wearing the blue dress Lydia had brought, staring out at the gardens bathed in moonlight that turned everything silver and black. She turned when he entered, and the moonlight caught her face in a way that made his breath stop because she was beautiful, had always been beautiful, and he had never allowed himself to notice before because she was a servant and he was a king, and the gulf between them was supposed to be unbridgeable. He told her that they needed to talk, that he had discovered things about her past that she deserved to know. And he watched her face cycle through emotions, fear, and hope, and resignation all mixing together in an expression that made his wolf whine with the need to comfort and protect. He sat beside her on the window seat, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, close enough that he could feel the heat of her body and smell the scent that was uniquely hers beneath the soap and silk. Something wild and sweet that made his mouth water and his control slip just a fraction. Then he told her everything, the prophecy and the destroyed village and the suspicion that she was not who she believed herself to be, watching her eyes widen with each revelation, seeing the moment when she began to truly understand the magnitude of what was happening. Ilara listened in stunned silence, her mind struggling to process information that fundamentally altered her understanding of her entire existence. She had spent 23 years believing she was broken, defective, less than everyone around her. And now this impossibly powerful Alpha King was telling her that she might be the opposite, might carry a bloodline so pure that people had committed murder to prevent it from manifesting. Part of her wanted to reject it all as some elaborate mistake or cruel joke, but another part, the part that had always known something was different about her even when she could not name it, recognized the truth in his words like a key finding the lock it was made to open. She asked the question that mattered most to her in that moment, her voice barely above a whisper, because she was afraid of the answer, but needed to know regardless. She asked if that was why he was interested in her, because of what she might be, rather than who she was, if his sudden attention was political calculation, rather than genuine connection. The mate bond might be real, but mate bonds could be ignored if the cost of honoring them was too high, and she had no intention of being a pawn in palace politics, even if the alternative was returning to the servants' quarters and a life of continued abuse. Theron reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and cupped her face in his hand with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone whose strength could break stone. He told her that he had felt the mate bond the moment their eyes met, before he knew anything about prophecies or bloodlines, before he had any reason to see her as anything other than what she appeared to be. His wolf had recognized her soul, and that was not something that could be faked or forced or politicized no matter how much power or influence someone possessed. Whatever she was, whatever she had been or would become, The bond between them existed independent of all of that, and he would honor it, regardless of the consequences, because fighting fate was the privilege of fools who had never felt the soul, deep certainty of finding their other half. The kiss that followed was inevitable, a collision of need and longing that had nothing to do with conscious decision, and everything to do with the magnetic pull that had been building between them since that first moment of recognition. Alara had never been kissed before, had never been touched with desire rather than cruelty, and the sensation overwhelmed her senses until the only reality was his mouth on hers, his hands in her hair, his body solid and warm against. Hers. Power sparked between them like electricity, her golden light rising to meet his in a display that would have been visible to anyone who happened to be looking at her window. Their combined energies twining together in patterns that felt older than memory, older than civilization, old as the first wolves who had howled at the first moon. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Theron rested his forehead against hers and told her that everything was about to become very complicated, that Queen Morgana would not surrender her position easily, that there would be challenges and danger and political maneuvering that could turn deadly if they were not careful. But he also promised that he would protect her, that she would never return to the servants' quarters or suffer abuse from anyone ever again, that he would move heaven and earth to keep her safe while they figured out exactly what her heritage meant and how to navigate the treacherous waters ahead. Alara. Wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this powerful alpha who barely knew her would actually put himself and his kingdom at risk for her sake. But years of disappointment had taught her caution, even in moments of unexpected joy. She told him that she needed to understand her own power before she could make any decisions about her future, that if she truly carried this legendary bloodline, she needed to learn how to access it deliberately, rather than just in moments of emotional extremity. She could not be anyone's mate, could not step into any kind of public role, if she was still essentially helpless and dependent on others for protection. Theron recognized the wisdom in her words, even though his alpha nature bristled at the idea of her facing any kind of challenge or difficulty. He told her that he would arrange for training, that his best warriors would teach her to fight, and his most knowledgeable scholars would help her understand werewolf history and the theories about bloodline manifestation. It would have to be done secretly at first, because revealing her potential before she could defend herself would paint a target on her back that every ambitious wolf in the kingdom would want to aim for. But in time, when she was ready, they would announce her true identity and deal with whatever fallout resulted from the revelation. The next weeks passed in a blur of intense activity, carefully hidden from the majority of the palace. Theron assigned Marcus as her primary instructor in combat and werewolf politics, trusting his beta to keep her safe while pushing her to develop her capabilities as quickly as possible. Marcus proved to be a demanding teacher who did not coddle her or make excuses for her lack of prior training. But he was also patient in ways that suggested he understood how overwhelming all of this must be for someone whose entire worldview had been upended. They trained in a private courtyard before dawn, when most of the palace was still sleeping, working on basic fighting stances and techniques that would give her at least a chance of defending herself if attacked. But it was the work with Elder Helena, the pack's oldest living scholar and keeper of historical records, that truly opened Alara's eyes to what she might be capable of. Helena was ancient by werewolf standards, her hair white as snow, and her face lined with centuries of accumulated wisdom. But her mind was sharp as ever, and her knowledge of bloodline magic. Unparalleled in the kingdom. She explained to Alara that most werewolves carried diluted versions of the original alpha bloodline, their power diminished by generations of interbreeding with lesser bloodlines, and the gradual loss of the old knowledge that had allowed the first wolves to harness the full potential of their nature. But occasionally, through some cosmic accident or divine intervention, a child would be born with genetics that somehow reached back to that primordial source, creating a concentration of power that could rival the ancient alphas who had shaped the world through will alone. If Alara truly was such a throwback, Helena explained, then her power would not be limited to enhanced strength or speed or healing like normal werewolves. She would be able to influence other wolves directly, compelling their obedience through sheer force of will, reading their intentions and emotions through the pack bonds that connected all werewolves to each other, possibly even healing. Injuries that would kill a normal wolf, or projecting her consciousness across vast distances to communicate with pack members who needed guidance. The golden light in her eyes was a physical manifestation of that power, trying to express itself, like steam building behind a dam that had been holding it back for far too long. The training to access that power deliberately was exhausting in ways that physical combat could never be, requiring Alara to turn her awareness inward and examine the Kao. Landscape of her own psyche with brutal honesty. Helena guided her through meditation techniques that had been passed down through generations of alpha bloodlines, teaching her to visualize her power as a living entity sleeping in her core, something that needed to be coaxed awake gently rather than forced into manifestation. The first few attempts resulted in nothing but frustration and headaches, but gradually, Alara began to feel something responding to her mental touch, a presence that was both her and not her, ancient and newborn at the same time, patient but eager to finally be acknowledged after years of imposed dormancy. Meanwhile, the political situation in the palace was deteriorating rapidly, as Queen Morgana realized that she was losing ground in ways she could not openly address. Theron had stopped sharing her bed, citing pressing kingdom business that required his attention, and he no longer consulted her on decisions that traditionally involved the Queen's input. Nobles who formed Morgana's support base were becoming nervous as rumors spread about the mysterious servant girl who had been elevated to guest status and who spent hours each day in the company of the king's most trusted advisors. Celestia reported that her father had rejected 3 separate marriage proposals from allied packs, claiming that political considerations made the matches unwise, though everyone suspected his real reason was that he had no intention of binding his daughter too. Alliances when his own marital situation was about to change dramatically. Morgana's solution to the problem was characteristically ruthless and direct. If she could not convince her husband to abandon his fascination with the servant girl through reason or political pressure, then she would simply ensure that the girl disappeared permanently, her death appearing accidental enough that no one could prove Morgana's involvement, but obvious enough that Theron would understand the message. The Queen. Had access to resources that went beyond simple palace guards, connections to assassins and dark practitioners who specialized in making problems vanish without leaving evidence behind. She reached out to a contact in the shadow markets, a wolf named Darius who had a reputation for completing contracts efficiently and without moral qualms, offering him a sum that would keep him comfortable for years, in exchange for one simple task. Darius accepted the job because he was a mercenary who cared. About profit rather than politics, but he was also smart enough to do research on his target before attempting the assassination. What he discovered made him uneasy in ways that a simple servant girl should not have been able to inspire, because the information pointed to connections and protections that went beyond what Queen Morgana had disclosed. The girl was under the direct protection of King Theron's personal guard, was being trained by Marcus Blackwood himself, and was spending time with Elder Helena in sessions that were carefully kept private from the rest of the palace. These were not the circumstances surrounding a casual dalliance or temporary fascination. These were the arrangements made for someone who mattered, someone who might matter a great deal if Darius was reading the situation correctly. He returned a portion of the Queen's payment and declined the contract, explaining that the risk-to-reward ratio was unacceptable, given the apparent interest the king had in keeping the girl alive. Morgana was furious at this unexpected development, but she was also alarmed because Darius's caution suggested that the situation was even more dangerous than she had suspected. If a professional assassin who feared nothing thought the job was too risky, then clearly Theron's commitment to protecting Alara went deeper than mere attraction. The Queen realized she needed to take a different approach, something that would remove the threat without directly attacking Alara. In ways that could be traced back to Morgana's involvement, her solution came from an unexpected source. Princess Celestia, who had been sulking about her father's rejection of her marriage proposals and his obvious preference for spending time with anyone other than his own daughter, suggested that perhaps they did not need to kill Alara, but simply prove that she was unworthy of the attention being lavished on her. If they could demonstrate that the servant girl was actually working with enemies of the kingdom, that her sudden appearance and convenient timing were part of a larger conspiracy, then Theron would have no choice but to treat her as a traitor, regardless of whatever personal feelings might be involved. Morgana recognized the brilliance of the approach, because it turned Alara's mysterious origins from a source of potential power into a liability that could be exploited. They began planting evidence carefully, subtle enough that it would not seem like obvious. Fabrication, but substantial enough that it could not be easily dismissed. Documents suggesting that Alara had been in contact with the Bloodfang Pack. Letters that implied she was gathering information about palace defenses and reporting back to someone outside the kingdom. Witnesses who claimed to have seen her meeting with suspicious individuals in the market district. None of it was true, but truth was less important than creating a narrative that would give Theron's political opponents the ammunition they needed to demand action against this upstart servant, who had somehow bewitched their king into abandoning both sense and propriety. Marcus discovered the conspiracy purely by accident, when one of the palace guards who owed him a favor mentioned overhearing Celestia discussing the planted evidence with one of her handmaids. The beta immediately went to Theron with the information, knowing that time was critical because once accusations of treason were made publicly, defending. Against them became exponentially more difficult regardless of actual innocence. Theron listened with growing fury as Marcus laid out the details of Morgana's scheme, his alpha rage building to levels that made the very stones of the palace seem to tremble with the force of his emotion. His wolf demanded immediate action, wanted to drag his faithless queen before the assembled court and strip her of title and privilege for daring to plot against his mate. But his human mind knew that such a dramatic confrontation would only create chaos that could be exploited by external enemies. Instead, he did something that required far more self-control than simple violence would have demanded. He continued with his normal routine, as if nothing had changed, attending meetings and handling kingdom business while Marcus and a handful of absolutely loyal warriors worked in secret to gather counter-evidence and identify everyone involved in the conspiracy. They traced bribes back to Morgana's. Personal accounts, found the witnesses who had been paid to lie, recovered drafts of the forged letters that showed Celestia's handwriting in the margins, where she had made suggestions for making the fabrications more convincing. Within 3 days, they had assembled an ironclad case that would destroy Morgana's credibility and political power if presented to the noble council. But Theron had learned something important about Alara during their time together, which was that she would not want him to act rashly on her behalf, would not appreciate being the cause of kingdom-wide upheaval, no matter how justified the response might be. She had told him repeatedly that she needed to stand on her own power, to prove herself worthy of whatever position she might eventually hold through her own merit, rather than simply benefiting from his protection. So instead of immediately exposing the conspiracy, he brought all the evidence to Alara and asked her what she thought should be done, giving her agency in a situation where most alphas would have simply made unilateral decisions. Alara studied the documents spread across the table in Theron's private study, her expression growing colder with each page. But when she finally looked up, her eyes were clear and determined rather than hurt or frightened. She told him that they should use the conspiracy as an opportunity rather than just shutting it down, that if they played the situation carefully, they could force Morgana and Celestia to reveal themselves publicly in ways that would permanently eliminate them as threats. She suggested that they allow the accusations to be made, that Alara would face trial before the noble council, as if the charges were legitimate, and during that trial, she would demonstrate her true nature in a way that could not be denied or dismissed. Theron initially rejected the idea, because it put her at risk in ways that made his protective instincts scream in protest. But Alara argued persuasively that they needed a public forum to announce her identity anyway, and a trial would provide exactly that, while also painting Morgana as the villain she actually was. If Alara could prove her bloodline and expose the conspiracy simultaneously, it would resolve multiple problems with one dramatic gesture, and establish her as someone strong enough to stand beside a king rather than just hiding behind his power. Marcus, who had been listening to the discussion, reluctantly agreed with Alara's reasoning. Pointing out that controlling the narrative from the beginning would be far more effective than trying to manage revelation of her identity through conventional channels. The trial was scheduled for the next full moon, a deliberate choice because werewolf law held that major judicial proceedings should occur when the moon's power was at its peak, allowing all wolves present to draw on their beasts for clarity of judgment. The noble council assembled in the great hall, every significant family, represented, with Queen Morgana and Princess Celestia occupying seats of honor as accusers bringing charges against a perceived threat to the kingdom. Alara was brought in wearing simple white robes, the traditional garb for someone standing trial, and Theron watched from the high throne with an expression of careful neutrality that revealed nothing of his true feelings or intentions. Leave a like if you are on the edge of your seat wondering how Alara will prove herself, and comment your predictions about what will happen when her true power is finally revealed to everyone in the kingdom. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these epic supernatural romance stories. Morgana stood and presented her case with all the polished rhetoric of someone who had spent decades navigating political intrigue. She described Alara as a spy who had infiltrated the palace years ago, who had hidden her true nature and waited for the perfect opportunity to strike at the heart of the kingdom. She presented the forged letters, called witnesses who testified to seeing Alara engaging in suspicious behavior, painted a picture of a conspiracy so elaborate that only a truly dedicated enemy could have orchestrated it. The noble council listened with expressions ranging from shock to satisfaction, depending on whether they were allied with Morgana or simply enjoying the drama of seeing someone else's downfall. When Morgana finished, the head of the council, Lord Aldrich of the Ironclaw Pack, turned to Alara and asked if she had anything to say in her own defense. The hall went silent, hundreds of wolves holding their breath in anticipation, and Alara stood slowly, moving to the center of the floor, where a circle had been marked in silver for the accused to stand within. She looked directly at Morgana as she spoke, her voice carrying clearly despite not being particularly loud, and she thanked the Queen for providing such an excellent opportunity to address several misunderstandings. That had persisted for far too long. She explained, with a calm that suggested complete confidence in her position, that she had indeed kept secrets about her identity, but not because she was working for enemies of the kingdom. She had kept them because she had not known the truth herself until very recently, had been deliberately kept ignorant of her heritage by people who feared what she might become if she ever accessed her full potential. Then she turned her attention to the assembled. Nobles, and told them that they were about to witness something that had not been seen in the kingdom for several generations, a bloodline manifestation that would prove beyond doubt that she carried the legacy of the first Alpha, the primordial power that had given birth to their entire species. The transformation was not like a normal werewolf shift, which involved pain and cracking bones, and the violent rearrangement of flesh into a different configuration. Alara's power rose from her core. like sunrise breaking over mountains, golden light blazing from her eyes and spreading across her skin in patterns that looked like ancient writing in a language no one present could read. The air itself seemed to thicken with energy, and every wolf in the hall felt their beasts react with confused reverence, instincts warring between the urge to submit to obvious dominance and the confusion of not recognizing this form of power from their collective memory. The light grew brighter until it was almost painful to look at directly, and then it coalesced into a form that was neither fully human nor fully wolf, but something that combined the best aspects of both. A hybrid shape that legend said the first alpha had wielded when walking among the earliest human tribes. She stood almost 7 feet tall in this form, covered in golden fur that seemed to generate its own light, with eyes that blazed like captured stars, and claws that could have carved through castle walls. Power radiated from her in waves that made even the strongest alphas in the council drop their eyes in instinctive submission, their wolves recognizing dominance so absolute that challenging it would be suicide. She was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, a throwback to an age when werewolves had been gods among mortals rather than simply predators among prey, and her very existence rewrote assumptions about what was possible within their species. Theron felt his own alpha nature bow before her power, not in defeat, but in recognition of an equal, perhaps even a superior. And the mate bond between them sang with triumphant certainty, because this was what it had known all along. That Alara was not someone who needed his protection, but someone who would stand beside him as a partner in every sense of the word. His wolf howled with joy inside his mind, finally understanding that they had found not just a mate, but a queen who would be worthy of the title in ways that had nothing to do with political. Marriages, or bloodline arrangements. The hall erupted in chaos, as nobles shouted questions and accusations, some demanding to know how this was possible, while others immediately began calculating political advantages of aligning with this new power. But Alara cut through the noise with a voice that carried undeniable authority, commanding silence with a word, and the fact that every wolf present obeyed without conscious thought proved her dominance more effectively than any demonstration of physical strength could have. She turned her blazing gaze on Morgana and asked the queen if she still believed Alara was a spy, if she truly thought that someone carrying this kind of power would need to skulk and scheme like a common infiltrator. Morgana had gone white as death, her political instincts screaming at her that she had made a catastrophic mistake. But before she could attempt to salvage the situation, Marcus stepped forward with the evidence of the conspiracy. He presented it. Methodically, showing how every piece of accusation against Alara had been manufactured, revealing Morgana and Celestia's involvement in detail that left no room for doubt about their guilt. The noble council listened in growing horror as they realized that their queen had attempted to destroy an innocent woman using fabricated evidence, had committed crimes that in any other context would be considered treason against the crown. Lord Aldrich, his face grave, asked Morgana if she denied any of the accusations being leveled against her, if she had any defense to offer against evidence that seemed overwhelming in both quantity and quality. Morgana tried to speak, to craft some explanation that would preserve her position, but words failed her because there was no spinning this kind of blatant conspiracy. Celestia attempted to defend her mother, claiming they had been acting to protect the kingdom from an unknown threat, but her justification rang hollow in the face of fabricated evidence and paid witnesses. Theron finally stood from his throne, his own power rising to match Alara's, and the combination of their energies filled the hall with a pressure that made lesser wolves whimper with instinctive fear. He pronounced judgment in a voice that carried the full weight of his authority as Alpha King, stating that Queen Morgana had forfeited her position through acts of conspiracy and attempted murder against a member of the royal bloodline. She would be stripped of her title and exiled to the outer territories, forbidden from ever setting foot in the capital again on pain of execution. Princess Celestia would face similar exile, as her participation in the conspiracy demonstrated that she lacked the judgment necessary to ever hold a position of authority within the kingdom. The nobles who had been allied with Morgana scrambled to distance themselves from her disgrace, pledging renewed loyalty to the king and carefully not mentioning their previous support of Ainoy. The Queen's political agenda. It was a brutal display of the pragmatism that governed pack politics, where loyalty lasted only as long as a wolf could provide advantage or protection. Morgana and Celestia were escorted from the hall by guards, who showed them no more respect than they would common criminals, and the queen who had ruled beside Theron for 20 years left the palace in shame, reduced to irrelevance by her own machinations. When the hall had cleared, and only Theron's most trusted advisors remained, Alara allowed her transformation to fade, returning to her human form with a weariness that suggested the display had cost her more energy than she had let anyone see during the trial. Theron caught her as her knees buckled, sweeping her into his arms with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the ruthless judgment he had just pronounced on his former wife. He carried her to his private chambers, dismissing everyone else with curt orders to ensure they were not disturbed. And laid her carefully on his bed, which was now effectively their bed, given that she would be moving from the guest wing to the Queen's suite. Alara slept for almost an entire day, her body recovering from the strain of channeling power that she still did not fully understand how to control efficiently. When she finally woke, she found Theron sitting in a chair beside the bed, watching over her with an expression that mixed relief and pride and possessive satisfaction. He told her that the entire kingdom was buzzing with news of what had happened, that messengers had already been dispatched to allied packs explaining the situation and announcing that the king would be taking a new queen, one who carried the bloodline of the first Alpha, and who would help usher in a new era of strength and justice for all werewolves, regardless of birth rank. Alara listened to his plans for the future, descriptions of reforms they would implement to ensure that no one else suffered the way she had. Ideas about establishing training programs to help identify and develop wolves with latent power who might otherwise never reach their potential. She appreciated his vision and shared his desire to create a more equitable society. But she also needed him to understand something important before they moved forward. She told him that she would be his queen, because the mate bond between them was real, and she could not imagine her future without him in it. But she would not simply be a decorative, figurehead who drew power from his position. She would be an active partner in governance, would have real authority and responsibility, would be respected for what she was, rather than just for who she had married. Theron pulled her into his arms and told her that he would expect nothing less, that he had known from the moment he felt the mate bond that she was meant to stand beside him as an equal rather than behind him as a subordinate. He had not survived decades of ruling by surrounding. Himself, with yes-men and submissive followers, had built his power on the foundation of trusting capable people to handle responsibilities that matched their abilities. Alara was easily the most powerful werewolf in the kingdom aside from himself, possibly more powerful than him in ways that would only become clear as she fully developed her gifts, and he intended to use that power to strengthen the kingdom rather than suppressing it out of insecurity or fear. Their mating ceremony took place. Under the full moon 3 weeks later, a celebration that drew representatives from every pack in the kingdom, and several from allied territories beyond their borders. Alara wore a gown of white and gold that seemed to capture moonlight in its folds, and when she and Theron stood together before the assembled wolves and bound their lives together through the ancient rituals that had sanctified werewolf unions for millennia, the power that flowed between them was visible even to human eyes, a golden aura that surrounded them both, and announced to anyone watching that this was a partnership blessed by forces older and deeper than simple political convenience. The feast that followed lasted 3 days, with nobles competing to demonstrate their loyalty to the new queen through ever more elaborate gifts and pledges of support. Alara handled the political theater with grace that surprised many who still remembered her as the silent servant who had kept her eyes downcast and never spoke. Unless addressed directly, she had transformed in ways that went beyond just accessing her supernatural power, had developed confidence and presence that came from finally understanding her own worth after a lifetime of being told she was worthless. But the true test of their partnership came not during celebration, but in the months that followed as they began implementing the reforms they had discussed. They faced resistance from traditionalists who believed that the old hierarchies were natural and necessary, who argued that elevating omegas and low-rank wolves would dilute the strength that came from maintaining bloodline purity. Alara dealt with these challenges by demonstrating repeatedly that power came in many forms, that some of the kingdom's most capable administrators and warriors came from bloodlines that traditionalists dismissed as inferior. She established schools where young wolves could develop their abilities regardless of birth rank, created programs that allowed talented individuals to rise through merit rather than just family connection. Theron supported her initiatives completely, using his authority to override objections from nobles who valued tradition over progress. Together, they gradually reshaped the kingdom into something that honored strength and capability, while refusing to use birth circumstances as the sole determinant of worth. It was slow work, requiring patience and political skill, but gradually, they built a society that was both stronger and more just than the one that had existed before Alara's true nature had been revealed. 5 years after their mating, Alara stood in the nursery of the palace, watching over twin infants who had inherited power from both their parents, in measures that suggested they would grow into alphas of extraordinary capability. a son with his father's dark hair and his mother's golden eyes, and a daughter who combined her mother's delicate features with an intensity of presence that made even hardened warriors handle her carefully. They represented the future of the kingdom, proof that strength could come from unexpected places, and that bloodlines thought extinct could rise again when given the opportunity to flourish. Theron entered the nursery quietly, wrapping his arms around Alara from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder as they watched their children sleep. He told her that he had received reports from the outer territories, former wasteland regions that were now thriving under governance that prioritized capability over birthright. The reforms they had implemented were producing results that exceeded even their optimistic projections, proving that their vision of a more equitable society was not just idealistic dreaming, but practical policy that made the entire kingdom stronger. Alara leaned back against him, comfortable in his embrace, and reflected on how far she had come from the terrified servant girl who had spilled wine at a royal banquet. She had discovered power she never knew existed, claimed a mate who valued her as an equal, and helped reshape a society that had tried to crush her into nothing. The journey had been painful and dangerous, requiring courage she had not known she possessed. But standing here in this moment, surrounded by family, and looking toward a future bright with possibility, she knew that every struggle had been worth enduring. The golden light that occasionally still flickered in her eyes was no longer a source of fear or confusion, but a symbol of everything she had overcome and everything she had become. She was Queen Alara Nightshade, mate to the Alpha King, mother to future leaders, and living proof that those who seemed weakest could become the strongest when given the chance to discover their true nature. And as she stood there, surrounded by love and purpose, she finally understood what the prophecy had truly meant, that power was not just about dominance or control, but about the strength to transform pain into purpose, to turn suffering into compassion, and to build something better from the ruins of what had been broken.